How Traditional Rhetoric Shapes the Public's Perception of Educators by Christina McGee. Traditional rhetoric is steeped in power, dominance, and patriarchal bias. In their essay, Beyond Persuasion, a proposal for an invitational rhetoric, Sonia K. Voss and Cynthia L. Griffin state that rhetoric has been defined as the conscious intent to change others. Voss and Griffin further state that embedded in efforts to change others is a desire for control and domination, for the act of changing another establishes the power of the change agent over that other. Exercising their power, the U.S. Department of Education formulated the National Commission on Excellence in Education. In April 1983, the commission issued their report titled A Nation at Risk. The seeds of distrust had been planted. As the commission states, we are raising a new generation of Americans that is scientifically and technologically illiterate. And we have, in effect, been committing an act of unthinking, unilateral, educational disarmament. This call for educational reform opened the pathway for educators to bear the burden of scrutiny under the microscope of change. James Herrick said of Michel Foucault, although power is an omnipresent dimension in human relations, power in a society is never a fixed and closed regime, but rather an endless and open strategic game. In 1999, former President George W. Bush set out on his campaign trail on a platform of educational reform. Accountability came in the form of standardized testing. Quote, without testing, reform is a journey without a compass. Without testing, teachers and administrators cannot adjust their methods to meet high goals. Without testing, standards are little more than scraps of paper. Without testing, true competition is impossible. Without testing, parents are left in the dark. Test scores would control funding. Quote, if scores are stagnant or dropping, the administrative portion of their funding, about 5%, will be diverted to a fund for charter schools. What former President Bush was actually saying, as years of implemented high-stakes testing crippled the educational process, with historic drops in state funding, was that teachers in impoverished schools, schools with the lowest capital and greatest need, would suffer and be placed under the microscope of shame. Perlman and Albrecht Tycho warn, the philosopher king who would use the political authority and power of the state to impose one moral standard on everyone. In Heating Wolf's Great Teacher, Stacy Otto says, but in schools and schooling, the organizational, administrative, and architectural structures conspire to isolate and fragment teachers' potential solidarity, subjecting them instead to suspicion, blame, accountability, and surveillance. John Tomlinson states in his article, Teachers and Values, that educators have carried not only the burden, but also much of the blame attributed to them, sometimes from ignorance, more often from confusion, anxiety, and malice, in the face of half-understood and much feared intellectual and social forces. Teaching is no longer seen as a professional career. Brilliant, creative educators are no longer respected as having authority in their subject area or having expertise in pedagogy. Educators have become the beasts of burden for all that ails education. Carolyn M. Shrewsbury states, under traditional conceptions of power as domination, justice requires that limits be placed on power and that balance of power be achieved in order to mitigate the results of domination. Shrewsbury further states, the conception of power recognizes that people need power, both as a way to maintain a sense of self and as a way to accomplish ends. Power can be used to enhance both autonomy and mutuality. Jacqueline Jones Royster tells us when the first voice you hear is not your own, that we are compelled to respond to a rendering of our potential that demands, not that we account for attributes, actions, and conditions, but that we defend ourselves as human beings. Herrick says of Habermas that cultural traditions must also be subjected to scrutiny through argumentative discourse, especially those ideas that lead to economic injustice. Teachers have begun to push back against the cultural traditions that have silenced our voices to bring about a balance of power and change the perception of educators.